Hi, everyone. Sorry to be a few minutes late. We'll just get started in about a minute. I believe Commissioner Sanchez is unable to attend, but we will have quorum with Commissioner Alexander. And thank you to the public for just waiting just another minute or so. Commissioner Alexander, I just saw you. Have you been here?
No. I got here just a minute ago. Sorry, I was a minute late.
No, I was too, so no worries.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for
recording in progress.
I call to order the meeting of the Budget and Business Services Committee for Wednesday, December 1st, 2021. And I want to mention that Section A is general information regarding the meetings of the board. And Deborah, please recognize and note the commissioners who are present. And we do have a quorum with Commissioner Alexander and Commissioner Sanchez will be absent this evening.
Okay.
I'd like to welcome Superintendent Matthews, Chief Wallace, Deputy Superintendent Lee, Director Gordon, district staff, and members of the public. Today we have one informational item, one very important, big informational item, which is our zero-based budgeting as budget stabilization plan. So at this time, I'd like to call on CFO Megan Wallace.
Thank you, Commissioner Lamb. Good evening, everybody. So if we can go ahead and share the presentation.
Oh, interpretation will be provided tonight also. They have interpreters. Do I need to read the numbers?
Hi there, this is the interpreter. So we can do it in English, in Spanish, in Cantonese.
Wonderful, go ahead, thank you.
Thank you. SFUSD is offering interpretation services in Spanish and Cantonese. If you need interpretation, please dial the following phone number. After dialing, please introduce the PIN number. This message will be repeated in Spanish and Cantonese. Buenas tardes, el Distrito Escolar Unificado de San Francisco ofrece servicios de interpretación en el idioma español. Si necesita interpretación por medio de Google Meet, por favor marque el siguiente número telefónico, seguido de la clave de acceso. Número telefónico 1-319-382-9676. Por favor, introduzca la clave 665-996-976, seguido de la tecla numeral. Gracias. Cantonese interpreter, please. Thank you.
大家好，三藩市聯合校區喺今晚嘅會議度係會提供廣東話嘅傳譯服務，所以如果你需要廣東話嘅傳譯服務，請打電話到1484-854-3328，然後輸入密碼721-609-895井。唔該晒 ，Thank you。
Deborah, does that wrap up our announcements?
Yes, it does. Commissioner, you can start the meeting.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you. Deborah, may I ask you if you could double check the permissions for Elliot Duchamp, our fiscal expert?
I sent him the link, but I'm having Jill also do it right now.
Okay, wonderful.
I did get the email. So I did send it to him, but I'm waiting for him to log in and I don't see him. Okay. So I asked her to do it again.
Great, thank you. I think we can go ahead and proceed since the beginning is really around orientation of why we're here, and we've been having a lot of great conversations with Mr. Duchamp about this subject. So I think he'll be familiar with it as it is. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. We are discussing the proposed budget balancing plan for SFUSD. And on the next slide, please. I just want to highlight two major components of the discussion this evening. The first part is Proposition G, or the Living Wage for Educators Act. I'm going to provide an update on the lawsuit and the anticipated revenues that we'll receive as a district, as well as the proposed use of those funds. And then Ms. Anne-Marie Gordon, our Executive Director of Budget Services, will also share some information about different scenarios of how school sites might adapt to changes in their budget. And this is part of the review of the proposed budget balancing plan, just discussing the trade-offs between the proposal and have an opportunity for the board and the public to share thoughts and ask questions about the plan as currently proposed. On the next slide, you can see that this is part of a series of various meetings. Just always want to orient us around the different phases of review of the balancing plan. In the first step, we rolled out the plan itself as an introduction. We're now in the second step of the process of discussing the plan and providing feedback, thinking about ways to iterate on the proposal. Just want to highlight that we did have a budget town hall last night. Thank you, Commissioner Lamb, for being a panelist, and to everybody else who joined and listened in and asked questions at that event. And now this evening, we're stepping into the first of two meetings where we'll, with the Board of Education specifically, to look at the proposed uses of Proposition G and discuss possible trade-offs within the plan. And of course, just keeping ourselves oriented around December 14th as the date where staff will be seeking Board of Education approval of the first interim report, which will include the balancing plan. On the next slide, I just want to remind everyone that this is, a stage that's fairly early on in a process that's heading us towards budget adoption. The balancing plan is for fiscal year 22-23. So while we're in fiscal year 21-22, we're planning for the next fiscal year's budget, and that. Here we are fairly early on in the stages, identifying this balancing plan that ultimately in the early months of calendar year 2022, staff will be working to implement that balancing plan so that ultimately we can bring a final budget proposal before the Board of Education in June in time to submit an adopted budget to CDE no later than July 1st. On the next slide, just since we're actually technically in a Budget and Business Services Committee meeting where we have definitely taken over the agenda to focus primarily on the budget balancing plan for some period of time, just want to highlight that we will have future BBS meetings covering some other areas of business that we've tabled for the time being. So want to highlight that tonight we're looking at the balancing plan. Next week, we're actually going to use the Committee of the Whole to cover informational items on the first interim report, as well as an expenditure plan for the educator effectiveness block grant. And then in January, we'll actually have a series of discussions around PEEF and the equity and arts resolution. So on the next slide, just want to go ahead and transition to this first point of discussion around Proposition G. On the next slide, I just want to give a little bit of background around Proposition G for anyone who's not familiar with it. As a reminder, in 2018, 61% of San Francisco voters authorized Proposition G, or the Living Wage for Educators Act, which is an annual parcel tax that property owners pay. And the anticipated revenue at that point in time in 2018 was $50 million to SFUSD that would be used to increase salaries and benefits for teachers and other school district employees, looking at additional funding for high needs schools and community schools. So all of those expenditures were encompassed in the intended use of LWEA. However, a lawsuit was filed arguing that we should have had a 2/3 supermajority vote in order to pass that ballot measure. And over the last 3 years, that lawsuit has been making its way through the California court system. And as a result, $150 million was withheld over that period of time, or $50 million annually. And then also, rather than halt the salary increases that had been anticipated under LWEA, the district moved to continue the expenditure plan related to LWEA, but we reduced those costs from $50 million a year to $40 million a year. And in order to do that, the city actually loaned SFUSD $26.6 million, and we withdrew $93.4 million from the district's rainy day reserve. And then because the total revenue was actually $50 million a year, over the course of that 3 years, $30 million of the parcel tax has actually gone unspent and has been held by the city in an escrow account. The wonderful news along the way of this story is that in November 2020, Proposition J was approved by San Francisco voters by over 74%, which well exceeds that supermajority vote. And Proposition J now replaces Proposition G. And this is important because just want to make sure everybody is oriented around the fact that Proposition J is the ongoing funding source for this, for the expenditures associated with this parcel tax. Proposition G is now in effect over, except for the $150 million that was held over this 3-year window of time. Next slide, please. So the other round of wonderful news that we only just recently learned about is that the California Supreme Court declined to hear the case on Proposition G, which in effect confirmed the California Appellate Court's ruling that the parcel tax should be upheld. So that authorized the release of these funds. And again, this is a one-time source. 3 years of Proposition G parcel tax has been accumulated, and now it's being released to SFUSD, recognizing that 123.4 million of those funds should go to SFUSD, whereas 26.6 million is intended to repay the city for its loan to the district. However, there is a plan by Mayor London Breed and Supervisor Ronan to introduce legislation that would forgive the loan to the district. But that does come with a very important condition that we as a district act to develop a budget stabilization plan. So now in effect, we actually have two parties that are looking at the actions of our school district, the city and county, that in order to forgive this loan, as well as the California Department of Education, is looking to the district, all with the eye of seeing that we're ready to stabilize our budget. And so I think we're definitely working along that path. So the proposal before you this evening talks about an assumption that we will receive the full $150 million. But even though $150 million has a breakdown, so just to walk you through it a little bit, When the Board of Education authorized the first withdrawal of funds from the rainy day reserve, that resolution called for $40 million to go back to the rainy day reserve. So staff is continuing to assume that that is a requirement, that of that 150 million, we would restore 40 million into our reserves. However, 53.4 million of that really in effect repays the expenditures that we made that were LWEA eligible, but using the rainy day reserve. And so because it's really a repayment to the district, those funds are more flexible and may be used for general purposes within our budget. But then on top of that, there's that $30 million that was unspent over that period of time. And those funds and any potential interest earnings that had accumulated over that period of time all must be used for LWEA eligible expenses. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, CDE and the city are watching the district closely at this point in time. And so we really must step forward and show that we're committed to addressing our structural budget deficit. But I do want to highlight that maintenance of our budget is really part of at least a 3-point balancing act that we play as a district, as a public organization that must balance its budget. We also have a real need to maintain an operating reserve and address our unfunded long-term liabilities and our commitments to staff. These are 3 factors that really, that the well-being and our ability to manage these factors will indicate the strength of our financial outlook and our overall stability. So you'll see in the proposal before you that all 3 of these components are taken into account with the use of this $150 million. I also just want to mention that our district's credit ratings have been downgraded in recent years, and all of the major agencies, Moody's, Fitch, S&P, look closely at these factors of, are we maintaining a balanced budget? Do we have a meaningful operating reserve? And are we managing our unfunded liabilities? And I would anticipate that if we don't take a balanced approach with our use of these funds, we will see further declines in our credit ratings. And why does that matter? Keep in mind that when we move forward with sales of our general obligation bonds, which are authorized by San Francisco voters to use the San Francisco property taxes to maintain our facilities, it's important for us to make those funds go as far as they possibly can. And if we have higher credit ratings, the cost of those funds is lower. And when we have poorer credit ratings, the cost of those funds is higher, and therefore the value doesn't go as far in maintaining our facilities. So it truly is important for us to maintain high credit. And so again, just overall, keeping in mind CDE, the city, as well as credit rating agencies, these are all things that should be taken into account. And I am recommending we take a balanced approach with our use of these one-time funds. Next slide, please. So in order to consider ways of how to use these funds and taking into account that balanced approach versus what would it look like if we weren't so balanced, staff examined a variety of scenarios just to see how things look. And I want to highlight first option A, which is the scenario that commits more funds to short-term budget balancing. So in this table, if you look at option A, you can see that there's $40 million for the rainy day reserve, $20 million to pre-fund OPEB, which represents our retiree health benefits, and then $90 million for staffing or budget stabilization. So option A really commits heavily to that component of that short-term need of balancing our budget. But the real problem with that is you can see that our OPEB liabilities remain very high. We're currently looking at a $1 billion OPEB liability. This $20 million investment scenario does bring that down, but you can see that over the next 10-year window, that liability continues to grow, and I would anticipate it could grow to as much as $1.5 billion. And when credit rating agencies, for example, look at this plan, they'll see that we're doing two things wrong. The one thing we're doing right is investing in our rainy day. The things that we're not doing correctly is we're not stabilizing our unfunded long-term liabilities with OPEB, and we're using a one-time source to stabilize our budget, which means that we're not addressing our need to right size how we're spending compared to the revenue that we're generating. And I know that CDE, as well as the city, would look at this scenario and question it. And then we would run the risk of, one, possibly having our balancing plan not be approved, and two, having the city decide that they should not forgive our loan. In contrast, option D, again, looks at the rainy day reserve as 40 million, but invests more in OPEB pre-funding and less in budget stabilization. So I think while it does significantly improve that long-term liability outlook, you can see that there's less going into budget stabilization, and that calls into question, is it possible for us to actually use more at this point in time to address our immediate needs? So that's where we get to options B or C. In options B or C, OPEB pre-funding is locked in at $60 million. This is a minimum amount necessary to be able to change our trajectory on our OPEB liabilities. Our actuary has said that if we invest that amount, they will recalculate our liabilities at a much lower rate, because in effect, by putting those funds away, they will generate their own interest earnings that help pay down and cover those liabilities of OPEB over time. For budget and staffing stabilization, that's actually where things are different between options B and C. Option B looks at the balanced needs of balancing our budget with the call of district employees for additional compensation. I think that we are seeing the impacts of the pandemic on our staff, either be it part of employees leaving our district due to financial hardship or other stress related to working under the pandemic-related conditions, or our inability to hire just simply because people aren't as incentivized to come join the district workforce in San Francisco. That need, we would propose considering $25 million to put forward to negotiate with our labor partners and consider a plan for spreading that one-time source of funds for one-time uses. And that may mean that these funds are spent over time, but we would need to negotiate the terms of the use of those funds. And that would leave $25 million for budget stabilization. I would propose using $10 million in the first year and $15 million in the second year, because as everyone's aware, the deficit deepens in the second year. So due to anticipated declines in enrollment, which flattens our revenue growth, as well as increased costs over time. So that's option B. Option C, in contrast, uses that $50 million solely for budget stabilization, where we could look to restore our investments that had been proposed for reduction. So in either scenario, we would want to look areas where we would want to prioritize restoring funding, such as weighted student formula, to increase funding for our school sites. So I hope this helps give sort of a picture of the different trade-offs between the various scenarios. I would recommend that while options B and C do provide the best balance between these three areas of setting aside funds for our reserves, pre-funding OPEB to address our unfunded liabilities, and then setting aside $50 million for stabilization purposes. There is a very clear argument for option B to be able to address the needs of our employees who have been calling for additional supports and payment as a result of the hardships of working through the pandemic. Next slide, please. So here I just want to briefly review the balancing plan. Overall, just as a reminder, the proposal is to reduce expenditures by $90 million. So you can see the total expenditures line in light green shows a reduction of 90 million. And then an increase in funding sources of $35 million. And that's a combination of shifting costs onto new grants, so new funding sources, and also utilizing fund balance that we've worked to set aside to help us stabilize our budget. On the next slide, I just want to demonstrate what it would look like if we were to look at option B, where we restore $10 million to our expenditures. And that in that scenario, I would recommend restoring to our weighted student formula. So you can see that rather than reducing site-based budgets by 50 million, we would restore 10 million and only end up reducing the budgets by 40 million. And we're able to do that because under the sources, you can see we have increased our sources overall by $10 million using the Proposition G funding. And then on the next slide, you can see what the overall plan looks like in more detail with those changes.
Megan, hold on just a pause. If I can please have panelists, please mute so there's not the feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. And then on the next slide, I'll go ahead and close out my section and then hand it over to Anne-Marie. But I just want to remind everyone that our projections are going to continue to evolve beyond this point in time. I think that Proposition G is a unique and valuable opportunity for the district to evaluate our priorities. And when I say unique, let's just say that not every school district has $150 million land on their laps when they're trying to build a budget balancing plan. But when we're evaluating our priorities, we just have to keep in mind it's not just what are our priorities within the budget that we're trying to balance, but also within those other line items related to our, restoring our reserves and addressing our liabilities. Those represent our larger financial structural package as a district. And so Proposition G does provide a unique opportunity for us to evaluate these priorities. And then also, you know, the financial projections are going to continue to change, particularly with the release of the governor's January budget. We are seeing that state revenues are exceeding the enacted budget in the current year. So we're anticipating that new revenues will be identified and can very likely improve our outlook. But on top of that, we as a district are advocating for changes in the local control funding formula, which our projections for revenue have declined because our enrollment has declined. However, we are making the argument that if enrollment has declined across the state, that there may simply need to be a change in the way that the state allocates funds to school districts. And then additionally, we're advocating for additional special education funding and other priorities. So these are all important elements to keep in mind that as we turn into the new calendar year, we will be coming back and having a lot more conversations, but at this point in time, we have to work with what we know. And it's for that purpose that we do need to move forward and reach agreement on a budget balancing plan. So with that, on the next slide, I'd like to please hand it over to Anne Marie.
Thank you, Megan, and good evening, everybody. So we just have a couple more slides to share this evening, and this is kind of a starting point to build from some of our previous conversations where there have been a number of requests to start understanding what the impacts of the current budget balancing plan would have on school sites. So on the next slide, we do have a number of caveats to these scenarios for a number of reasons. I really want to emphasize that while we did use real school budgets and real staffing data to put together these scenarios, they are illustrations. They are not final decisions. They are not, right? They're not set in stone. It's really meant to be an example of how the combination of a reduction in weighted student formula, a potential reduction to MTSS, the multi-tiered system of supports, or other allocations might come together in a school's budget. So the information is approximate, and really what we have done is modeled these potential changes by looking at draft numbers, right? Draft projected enrollment numbers, draft weighted student formula, preliminary allocations. But just I want to really put that asterisk on these scenarios simply because we do have time between the board's vote on the budget balancing plan and finalizing allocations to share in the first few weeks of February. And so they are reflective of the proposed plan, but they have also been generalized. And so I just really want to make sure that nobody feels as if we're selecting certain schools or anything like that. It's all been generalized to give a sense of how changes might be made. And in particular, I will say that we've looked at a couple of examples where there are more significant or more noticeable drops in enrollment, just to help illustrate what, in some cases, a more significant reduction could potentially look like for a school. So keeping all that in mind, we can go to the next slide, which is an example of a small elementary school. And I do encourage everyone to take some time and look at the different slides. I'll briefly walk through them, but I also, I think it's helpful to kind of go through the pieces, at a pace that works for you and kind of working through all of the information. But looking at this slide, up at the top, we have 5 years of enrollment trends that we used for weighted student formula. So these are, and it includes our initial projection for 22-23. The table below that is looking at, again, at an elementary level, a sample of how classrooms might be organized. And so here you can see, based on the projected enrollment by grade and the number of classrooms, then, right, what the class sizes would be and what that would mean in terms of a change from the current state. In this case, it could mean a reduction of classrooms where there have traditionally, or for the past few years, been very small kindergarten and first grade classrooms. Then on the right, we bring in not just weighted student formula and classrooms, but a look at the other support staff at a school site. And this is an example where what we've done is really put all the pieces together and just go through an exercise to model how a school might balance their budget, considering all of their allocations in one, kind of putting it all together. It doesn't mean that this is a decision that would be made. It was just going through, looking at what are the pieces of our weighted student formula baseline, how much money is there to maintain current staffing, and where might a school need to look at how they focus their supports, and how they may need to scale back staffing. And so this is a case where the proposed weighted student formula baseline does include the funding for a full-time administrative partner. But as a small school, it appears that this site has also used funds to make sure that they have a full-time nurse and paraprofessionals to support students in the classrooms and some other staff. And so this was a case where, although an administrative partner is in the baseline, perhaps the other kind of wraparound comprehensive coaching and social emotional supports may be the highest value to this site. Again, just an example, but looking at how a budget might be balanced. And I think also one piece to note here is if you go through those changes, a reduction of 2 FTE teachers, an administrative partner, and a second literacy coach. This is looking at how a school might balance with a reduction of $300,000 to $400,000. It's a significant reduction. And so I think I do want to name that this level of a staffing reduction is a large dollar amount to balance to. But I also think what you see here is, while that reduction is true, there's also, the school is able to maintain a reasonable set of supports for its students. Next slide, please. The structure of this slide and the following are the same. It's 3 different scenarios. This is one that is a larger elementary school, so you can see that the enrollment is more in the 400 to 500 student range. And there's a similar situation here because of a large drop in enrollment over the past 5 years, where classrooms could be reduced with class sizes being maintained at reasonable levels. This is a site that does not have the same level of multi-tiered system of support staffing. And so you can see that there are those supplemental supports in place, but not to the same degree. However, again, this is one illustration of how reductions could be made and the supports that would still be in place at this school site. Next slide. Our final example here is a larger middle school. And really, the idea here was to start to build a format and build a structure to share this information. When it comes time to really finalize school allocations, we will still go through our school planning and budget development processes in February and March. And so what that means is that, again, this illustrates considerations that will need to be made. And I think we will be thinking more about how to provide guidance and recommendations, in particular, I think around the weighted student formula baseline, and how to use that as a starting point for budget considerations and staffing considerations. But what you can see here is that there isn't only one way, I think, to balance these budgets across the different support staff. We tried to take, a couple of different approaches for how that might happen, but it isn't, right? It is not a one size fits all, and this will not be the exact same case for every site. So I think I'm more than happy to answer questions, and I think, we'll want to continue to understand where we should provide more specificity or develop more scenarios. We are looking really closely at starting to do this school by school deep dive to make sure that when it comes time for allocations, we understand what kinds of decisions schools may need to make as they look to balance their budget and as budgets are aligned to enrollment. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and hand it back to Megan for the final slide.
Thanks, Anne Marie. Next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry to keep saying this over again, but I think it's good to be grounded in our process that, just as a reminder, we did review the budget balancing plan over the course of November. And this is the first of two opportunities to discuss and iterate on this proposal, although the next meeting is just next week. So we're moving fast here, everybody. But I think this evening, when it comes to the discussion, just some ideas of things that I'd love to hear from the board and from the public on is around the balance that's struck in the proposals around staffing and budget stabilization. Thinking about if we were to restore funds in terms of our budget balancing plan, does it make sense to restore $10 million to the weighted student formula? Is that the right approach? And then just keeping in mind that the appendix includes all of the other slides from prior presentations. So if anyone wants to dive in and take a look or a closer look at any aspect of the plan, I would welcome and encourage us to do that. So thank you. We're happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Megan and Anne Marie for your work. Before I open up to public comment, I wanted to ask commissioners and student delegate for any clarifying questions. And I believe Commissioner Bogus had your hand up earlier. Go ahead.
Yes, I had two clarifying questions. On the proposed kind of budgets that showed the sites that were kind of scenarios, I guess it was a large middle school, the reduction to a literacy coach. And now, would that be a decision that was actually made at a school site, or is that a decision that was made at central office? To my knowledge, it'd be a school site making that decision for themselves. Is that correct?
In this case, yes. I think there is it will depend a little bit on the MTSS allocations. There would be cases where a school, has a reduction in their MTSS allocation, and that could mean reducing a lit coach. But in this particular scenario, this is looking, I believe that this is based off of a tier 1 larger middle school, which means that they do not have that lit coach allocation through MTSS, so site funds.
Okay, I appreciate that. That does concern me whenever we ask school staff to get rid of vital staff that serve certain populations, and look forward to having more questions about that. My next question was about slide 10, where we showed the different options, A, B, C, and D. And I was just wondering if there was any more clarity that was available on the $25 million split in option B. And kind of what it would look like to spend that money, and kind of the expectation of kind of how far that money would reach in helping to address labor issues and other kind of things that we would be stabilizing with. I just kind of want to get a clear picture of kind of how that money could be used if we're going to redirect it.
Deputy Superintendent Lee, I see your hand up. Did you want to respond?
Thanks, Commissioner Lamb. Yes, I just wanted to sort of on a process note mention that although we're sharing some information at a high level tonight about possible choices in terms of setting a certain range of funds aside, we would want to be cognizant of the boundaries of what kinds of discussions can take place away from the bargaining table, or tables as the case may be. So in that light, would just suggest that to the extent staff should present our thinking and seek the board's direction about potential proposals in a bargaining context, we would seek to do that in a closed session. And have the proper discussions with our labor partners in a bargaining context. And I see Dr. Matthews has come on screen if if I messed anything up there.
No, you didn't. I was just going to say at a very high level, this is about doing everything we can to stabilize our labor partners. And so definitely those kinds of discussions of what it would be used for would definitely be at the bargaining table. But we would, as we always do, seek board's direction in closed session.
Commissioner Bogus, did you have any follow-up for a clarifying question?
I think I guess, does staff feel that the 25 million that is attributed there is like significant? Is that too much like to say even in this context? I guess I'm just trying to get an understanding. Okay.
Thank you. Commissioner Alexander?
Thank you, Commissioner Lamb. So maybe just clarifying questions, following up on that last line of conversation. I had thought that all of Prop G was supposed to be negotiated with UESF. Is that not the case? I guess, you know what I mean? That this whole conversation would take place at the bargaining table.
I can try to address that, Commissioner Lamb and Commissioner Alexander. The MOUs that we have with our respective labor partners do apply differently to Prop G versus Prop J. And our MOU with UESF in particular for Prop G and for Prop J outline that 75% of the revenues in any given fiscal year would be subject to an MOU between the district and UESF. That said, in the Prop J MOU, which was ratified this past August, that part of the provisions in that MOU were that the Prop J MOU basically takes the place of the Prop G MOU. So we are now square in terms of all of the formal boundaries of negotiations related to Prop G as well as Prop J. So this would be an additional layer of negotiations on top of that context.
Okay, so it's not, so you're saying it's not subject, or I guess I'm...
By mutual agreement, nothing prevents both parties from entering into additional negotiations, but we are not currently bound by any outstanding provisions of previously negotiated MOUs.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Deputy Superintendent. My second question was around the proposed payment to the rainy day fund and how that relates to our operating reserve. Is the rainy day fund considered part of that operating reserve, or is that separate?
It has historically been separate, and when we're reporting to the California Department of Education, because the city's funds aren't held by the district, they haven't historically been calculated. However, I think one other point of discussion for the board to consider is if we would want to hold those funds in the district's reserve, really with the same constraints I would recommend as when they're with the cities in the city's account. Because one, we want a lot of controls. We want the board to have to act that there's a real demonstrated need to draw down those funds. But really just from an administrative standpoint, it's very helpful to have the cash in our accounts to help cover the various dips that we have throughout the year. Just last year, we had to do a short-term borrowing to cover for such a dip. If we'd had those funds in our accounts, we might not have otherwise have had to do that. And furthermore, it makes it clearer in our reporting that those funds are part of our calculated reserve in the eyes of CDE. The rating agencies are really good about digging up those numbers and building them into their calculation of how much we have in hand to cover ourselves in the event of a rainy day. But having them in our own account would make it all the more transparent.
Thanks, Chief Wallace. And is that I'm just trying to get a sense of where we would get to between that 4% and 10% you mentioned. If we put 40 million, let's assume for these purposes that it was in our reserve, what would that get us to on an ongoing basis? Do you know what I mean?
So I've calculated that it would get us at approximately 6%.
Okay. So we could add more theoretically if we wanted to get closer to 10.
Yes, and 10 is sort of the magic number. I don't know if you're pulling that off of one of the slides.
From your slide, yeah. No, I was
Yeah.
using what you
Yep.
said, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, oh, good, you got 10.
I was listening.
From the credit rating agency standpoint, that's the ideal number. I would say that many districts probably have a difficult time achieving that, although clearly we were well in that range before we drew down from the rainy day reserve. So we just hadn't given ourselves credit for it in terms of our documentation.
I have one last clarifying question, and if this is outside the scope of this meeting, feel free to defer this, but it's more about the OPEB contribution, and just curious if we could get some more information on how those projections are calculated. So like I said, I think I said it at a previous meeting, I really support the idea of doing it. I guess I just want to make sure that we're being very transparent about, for example, what's the current demand on the trust? What's the projected growth of that demand? How did we get to that number? Those different calculations. Because I think it is a big investment, and I think we just want to make sure that we're providing everyone that information.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe Megan or Commissioner Alexander, I have lots of questions and follow up to that as well. If we can just hold that for discussion, perhaps after public comment. How's that?
Yeah, that's fine with me. And like I said, maybe not even this. I don't know if that's for this meeting even, but I just want to.
No, I think it's definitely. I would like for us to actually have a little bit of discussion there, since it is part of the balancing plan, and would want to make sure that the staff is clear about our as we come into the final weeks of December 14th in that balancing. So with that, thank you, colleagues. I think that is all for clarifying questions. And so I would like to open it up for public comment, please, Deborah.
Yes, can we have that translated in Spanish and Chinese too, please? If you want to raise your hand to speak to this item, please do it.
Por favor, levante su mano si desea añadir un comentario público. Gracias.
如果你想對呢個計劃發表意見嘅話，請而家喺 Zoom 嗰端撳舉手個掣，咁咧就可以發表意見嘅。唔該晒。
How many minutes, Commissioner?
We have 4. Let's do 2 minutes, up to 2 minutes, please.
Okay. Alan? Alan Lee? Alan?
Maybe we can come back to them.
Rory?
Hi. So I wanted to, I heard a lot about balancing the budget, but there's also concerns that Mike Fine mentioned at the LCAP meeting about reporting and compliance around reporting LCAP processes, and making sure that the budget is transparent and that we have just one budget and not multiple, and nobody quite understands where the money is going. So I'd like just a request that going forward that you talk about some of those, how you're going to resolve some of those state of California legal and compliance issues around public having full access and clear information about what's going on with the budget, and having just one budget going forward. Thank you.
Okay. Patricia? Patricia?
Sorry. Sorry about that. Hey, everybody. My name is Patricia Barraza. I am a Beacon director as well as a student, former student of SFUSD. I went through peer resources programs all through middle and high school and also as an intern, which definitely affected the choice that I made as a career moving forward. So I would just love to put it in your ear again that although I'm sure you hear back and forth many programs that are advocating for themselves to stay in the budget, peer resource is one that I definitely want to keep considering and keep talking about. I have not heard whether we are still in the budget or not in the budget, but I do want to make sure that I do highlight the fact that it is a needed program and that we are here to talk and we are here to figure it out. And our students are benefiting greatly from leadership programs in our district on a daily basis. Thank you.
Let's see. Leslie?
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. My name is Leslie Hu. I'm the Secretary of UESF. I wanted to speak on and remind us all the intention of what Prop G is, right? It's to recruit and retain educators by inching, I say the word inching, towards a living wage. It's called the Living Wage for Educators Act. And using Prop G in this way is not what the voters of San Francisco intended. It doesn't address the other real problem in addition to the deficit. The deficit, we all know it's a really big issue. We have to be focused on that. But the other problem is that we have an increase of over 620% of educator resignations this year. It's only December 1st, 620. That's the percentage increase over previous years. And so using Prop G money in this way to address a structural deficit requires structural solutions, as Ms. Wallace said. And using these funds earmarked for something totally different is replicating the mistakes that have gotten us here to begin with and is fiscally irresponsible. And I really want to kind of make sure that we have that intention in our minds as we're talking about these monies. Thank you.
Jasmine?
Hello, I am a senior at John O'Connell High School, and I just kind of want to build on what Patricia said and kind of how essential that is. Considering I come from like an underfunded high school, I do really think that we need to keep funding our programs, particularly the DCT program, which is a construction trade, and it's really essential to our high school because we don't really have anything else to offer, and taking away those opportunities will really deteriorate on students' educations, considering that we don't have a variety of classes to offer. And I think it's essential to offer the proper nourishment and enrichment for students to have a really great education.
Let's see, Zoe? Zoe? Okay, nobody's there. Jerry.
Hey, good evening. This is Jerry Almanza. I'm the UESF treasurer. So, you know, okay. So this one-time money shouldn't be used to solve our systemic risk management problem. I feel really disappointed that our finance team is still continuing to try to solve a structural problem on the backs of our students and our educators. Those proposals that were shown, you know, you're showing, 2-3 people cut per site. That is not what our students and our families need right now. We are still struggling through COVID. Our families are still struggling. Our teachers are quitting on a daily basis. Dr. Matthews, you've been subbing, right? Like, we don't have enough people. Like, how does it make sense to not ensure that every classroom and every school site is fully funded and has the resources that they need? This money that we have needs to be used to support our students. We need to invest in our students. When it's been a continued disinvestment, our district has money. We're just not putting it in the right place. I still don't see any changes to the admin section. Like, I don't understand why it is that we're protecting top upper management, but yet we are cutting the people that are working with our students directly on a daily basis. This one-time funding is not the solution to the structural deficit. We need to retain our educators. We need to support our students. Thank you.
Let's see, Julie.
Hi, I appreciate the breakdown that shows the impact on school sites. That's really helpful as our school site council starts trying to understand how this will impact us. But what I see is really concerning. I have a hard time seeing the equity in this plan. We know the demographics of a small elementary school with 200 or fewer students, and we know the demographics of an elementary school that's larger with 530 students. So if my math is correct, we're saying that the small elementary school with 17 staff would lose 5 staff, which is about a third of the adults on their site. That's a dramatic impact on a school. On the other hand, if you look at the larger elementary school with about 27 staff losing about 3, that's about a 10% impact. And even at those school sites, that's going to hurt. Is that at either of these sites, is that the new dynamic teacher who's working to integrate ethnic studies into the school? Is that the new dynamic teacher who's supporting the ELAC? Because that's what the new teachers are doing at our school site. On the flip side, I agree that Prop G is a unique opportunity. It's dedicated sustainable funds, and Prop G does include a promise to Black students for $2.7 million a year of community school dollars. Doing the math on that, that's $8.1 million for schools serving Black students, and the equity that's built into that agreement prioritizes schools that serve Blacks or have a majority of Black students, with dedicating about $6 million to 10 schools, or about $600,000 per school site. If you can imagine the impact that completing that promise would have for schools. For schools that are considered equity gap schools, that's still $2.1 million divided by 10 schools. That's $210,000 for each school site. I would ask that you complete the promises of Prop G, come up with a more equitable solution for balancing the budget. Thank you.
Zoe.
Hi, are you able to hear me this time?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Amazing. Sorry, not sure what happened the first time. Yeah, I am a TSA with the Career Technical Education Department, and I have a couple of students here who are hoping to speak about their experiences being in CTE pathways. So I'm going to give it to Horace to go ahead and share his experience.
Hello, my name is Horace. I'm in 12th grade at Washington, and I'm in the automotive engineering program. It's a great experience and opportunity for you to get like hands-on learning with cars, and it's the only high school in the city that offers this. And it's like a lot of us want to go into the automotive career when we leave high school, so it's a great opportunity to get exposed to stuff that not a lot of high schoolers can experience.
Good evening. My name is Ibrahim. I'm an 11th grader at George Wash High School. I like how this school had that program for auto shop. I got a letter from Lowell High School, and I had to transfer to this school for this program especially. And I think it's one of the reasons I go to school every day. Without it, I don't think like it's not the same experience I would have every day. Like even though like we go here with friends, and it's like without it, I'll just like skip buses and just leave.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I don't know.
Rennie?
Hi, my name is Renee Ashba. I'm a counselor and Avid Site Coordinator at Hoover Middle School, and I just want to speak up about the Avid program. You know, the numbers are on the website of how effective the program is at getting our students starting in middle school through high school and graduating and going to college. The program like directly aligns with Vision 2025. And so I'd love for you to reconsider totally cutting it out of the budget. Thank you.
Ingrid?
Hello, my name is Ingrid Reyes. I'm a SFUSD alum. I graduated in 2019. And I just wanted to touch on the AVID program as well. I currently also work as a college ambassador at SFUSD, and I just wanted to add that I know that one of the programs that might be cut in funding and might be eradicated. And I wanted to add the importance that it is for students. I personally saw it as an AVID student helped me have an upper leg when I was applying to colleges, specifically junior and senior year. And also working with the seniors this last year, it showed the difference on how seniors in the AVID program did have an upper leg, able to apply to colleges, have early access to those materials, while others struggling to gain that because they weren't in the program. So I just wanted to emphasize the importance of the program and how it does help minority groups and overall just expose them to the chances of going to college and help them get a better future for themselves. Thank you.
Let's try Alan Lee one more time. Alan? Oh, okay, we have another one. So Kevin?
Good evening, board members. My name is Kevin. I'm a San Francisco State student and a former ELD student at Lincoln. And recently I've had the opportunity to work as a college ambassador at Lincoln as well. And I would like to share my experience working in the AVID environment and working closely with one of my students was a first generation Samoan student, and who in the first meeting I saw, she had like a lot of motivation to go to college, but a lot of questions and doubts regarding what will happen after high school. Fortunately, as the first few weeks passed, I was able to work closely with her and the AVID teacher as well, and she understood the steps she needed to take to have a safe future. But most importantly, she understood why she needed to take why she wanted to take those steps. And just the week after the college application opened, she already had done all of her applications. And she was not only leading herself to a brighter future, but also inviting her peers to follow the same path as she would invite them to come inside the AVID class. And honestly, this wouldn't be possible without the right teacher and the right space and the right support. And overall, this wouldn't be possible without AVID. So I just wanted to highlight the importance that AVID has in my community at Lincoln and other communities as well.
That's all there is, Commissioner.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the public for your comments, and just want to acknowledge how important it is to have the engagement of our community as we go through this budgeting and stabilization plan. And although a very difficult one, but very necessary. I just want to also extend my appreciation again for last night's community partners in putting together and engaging in the community town hall. We had strong participation, as well as the release of the survey that is gone out to families for their engagement to our stakeholders as well, more broadly. So with that, I would like to open it up to my colleagues for discussion. I do want to recognize time. The last two meetings, I think I have kept you all over. We will also be discussing the budget this upcoming Tuesday's meeting on December 7th. So just wanted to have this discussion, open the space up for the next 45 minutes or so, and so that I can wrap up our committee right on time. And with that, I also want to reference back to slide 20 of the presentation to help us guide. I certainly appreciate if my colleagues would, have your questions that are related to some of the guiding questions around, what staff has proposed tonight around the Prop G. Does that strike that right balance of stabilization with staffing? Thoughts around, the restoring $10 million to weighted student formula. Is that the right direction? And are there specific areas of the plan that requires that we would like to have closer review, discussion, and details? And then we'll also like to have the discussion around the OPEB and that Commissioner Alexander raised earlier. So with that, Commissioner Bogus, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I guess for me, I would just say, I think the option that I am like naturally more inclined to is like option D, and putting the most money towards kind of paying down the amount that's owed. And I think I'm really interested in the flexibility that we gain as a district from option B or option C. And I guess at this point, I guess, like, how much clarity would we kind of have on what it looks like to actually do that? Or is it more like this is all the clarity we kind of can have right now, and we kind of have to figure out and hope for like best intentions out of it versus worst case scenario for kind of the impact of it? I guess I'm trying to understand how much clarity I can have to expect about the impact of those dollars being diverted versus the impact of them kind of being paid to pay that down. I don't know if there's any clarity that can be provided around that. I'm just curious. Just how much more like information we can have, or if it is just making a decision based off the information we kind of currently have in front of us.
Commissioner, just to clarify, are you wondering about the impacts of the funds to like how about the details of the OPEB investment, or how those funds would be used and the benefit for budget or staffing stabilization?
Yeah, the benefits of staffing and budget stabilization
Hey, girl, were you there at that meeting just now with UBC?
Versus the OPEB pre-funding, and just kind of, yeah, I guess just a little bit more about the thoughts and the rationale and kind of the overall benefit that, families and sites would expect to kind of see from that decision versus like option D. Does that make sense? Comparing option B to D and the impact, both kind of in the next few years and kind of long term.
I think the rationale for option B that I tend to lean on is we are seeing vacancies in positions. We're having a hard time recruiting employees into our district, and it's sort of the hidden impact of that we've discussed a bit, but it's hitting us differently than talking about budget cuts. Like budget cuts, we're making decisions around how to stabilize and balance our budget. We're sort of making those hard choices through those discussions. But the vacancies are currently happening, and I think have a true impact at our school sites. We think about the drain on, just even starting with the staff who are trying to support our students, and starting with our students and are they being supported. If there are vacancies where staff is having to be juggled around, we can't bring in substitutes. You've got to move one student, students between classes to try to make sure that they have a teacher because we couldn't get a substitute on time. Just the drain on our administrators because we aren't adequately staffing our sites, and then taking that also to the central allocations where we're not able to hire paraeducators to provide the supports that our students need.
I would add that it's in a typical year, we probably wouldn't, especially at a time when we know we are trying to develop a plan to stabilize our budget. We might not be making or have this in a stabilization plan, but this year is like no other year. I think you probably have heard this from either teachers or paraprofessionals or custodians or principals. As Chief Wallace was just saying, a big part of the issue is that as people continue to, typically if people left during the year, we would be able to hire within a few days, if not a week at the longest. That's just not the case. We still have people during a week, 7 people will resign. We're not able to fill those holes. And the other impact that it's having is that as we have these vacancies, staff members are having to cover those vacancies. So usually they may have a prep, they don't have that prep, and it's causing wear and tear on staff and, to be honest with you, taking morale down. So we're just trying to look at some of the ways that we could possibly both do everything we can to keep people from leaving, as well as try to boost morale. And as said earlier, we'll have more conversations about this with you in closed, and of course with our labor partners.
No, I appreciate that clarity and for that additional information. I feel like that was very helpful for me. I guess my last question on this subject, then maybe I will let other commissioners ask questions, maybe have opportunity to go again later if possible, is could we kind of talk about the ways that these funds will be used in kind of the long-term impact? Because I guess what I'm worried about is that if we put this money aside now, does that mean that we are essentially kicking the can down the road in some way, shape, or form, and it would have a greater negative impact kind of in the future on our ability to kind of staff or resource different programs and things of that nature, if that makes sense?
If we go ahead and invest the funds in OPEB, will it create other challenges?
No, if we spend the funds on support for staffing and budget stabilization now versus OPEB, I think I'm just kind of wondering, like, is there anything that money is going to that will eventually have to be reduced or cut out kind of based on our current budget projections? Or is that things that are kind of outside of that process, if that makes sense?
Well, I would say that for the staffing stabilization, it will be critical that those are one-time investments because this is a one-time source. So if down the road, new funds come in and there's a choice on the part of the district to prioritize use of those funds in the staffing stabilization, that's a choice that could be made later, but just want to be clear that this is a one-time source for a one-time use is how we would need to negotiate it to make sure that we're not creating a larger deficit for ourselves down the road. And so I think on the staffing side, in that way, we're not kicking the can and creating a deeper deficit, but on the restoration of funds on the budget for budget stabilization, because it is a one-time source, in that way we are kicking the can on that component of our budget balancing. And so if we were to see additional state funds come in that are ongoing and can support those operations, I would recommend that either we, I guess there are two parts. One, either we move those one-time Prop G sources out of that restoration and only rely on the ongoing source to cover that cost, or we simply build in to our projections that in the third year, in fiscal year 24-25, that we would see a decline in that funding source, and that would have to be then part of our budget balancing strategy for that fiscal year. So there's a little bit of both, I guess, to answer your question. There's some that if we make it one time, it's not a problem, but part of it is ongoing, and therefore we are continuing to maintain some of that structural destabilization for ourselves.
Megan, as a follow-up to that, I'm sorry we didn't have the slides of the third year, and I know that the third year through 3 through 5 are pretty quote squishier, but maybe could you speak to that of that deficit in that third year? Does it continue? It does continue to deepen.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think until we see some real shifts in our state funding, particularly with our trajectory on enrollment, which is currently aiming downward. We are looking at ongoing deficits, even with these budget control measures. In those following fiscal years, there are deficits in our outlook. So all the more reason why I'll keep saying we're building the muscles, we're learning to have these conversations around prioritization, because really the conversation is not going to stop after this year. That being said, that I know we're all eager to see how the state manages the statewide decline in enrollment, and if we do see potentially increases in per ADA funding, that could help our outlook. But I think the reality is that particularly with things like healthcare, pension, retiree benefits, these things just keep growing at paces that are generally faster than our revenue growth.
Thank you. Commissioner Alexander?
Thanks. Yeah, just to pick up on this thread of conversation and the kicking the can down the road metaphor, I guess that concerns me also. When I first heard about the Prop G decision, I was really excited. I was like, oh, that's great. We can cut less, right? But over the past couple of days, as I've been reflecting on it, and even just listening to you talk right now, Chief Wallace, I think I just have real concerns about that, because I feel like we're putting off, effectively, if we use some of the Prop G funds to spend to cover the deficit in the next 2 years, it's just creating this cliff again in the third year, and that just feels like putting off a hard decision. And so that concerns me. And that's why that's why I was sort of asking about, could we put more in the rainy day reserve? I'd almost rather invest more of that money in the rainy day reserve so we have it. So if things get bad, we can use it, but still kind of force ourselves to make the hard decisions that we need to make to be fiscally responsible right now. That's kind of what I'm thinking right now. I guess a related question to that would be, when do we really have to decide? Because my other question would be, could we wait, see the state outlook in January? I'm concerned if we say, oh, we're going to add 10 million or 20 million back to the budget balancing plan now, it kind of, again, lets us off the hook. But if we by December 14th have to pass a worst case scenario plan, we assume we use none of the Prop G money for that. Then we see where the state is in January. We kind of go through the process. And if we want to then restore a little bit of it using Prop G, we could. That also just feels better to me in some ways. So I'm just curious about the timeline also for that.
Yeah, I would agree with your summary that we can very well move forward a worst case scenario balancing plan. And that the decision around Prop G, I would say that there's not real urgency to it. I think the main strings that are attached to it is that we are, if we want to assume the full 150 million that the city will forgive our, $26.6 million loan, that we're demonstrating a real effort to stabilize our budget and our fiscal outlook. So I think maybe the one thing that gives me pause is, if there is a commitment on the part of the board to show that we are intending to use those one-time funds to help restore our rainy day reserves and pre-fund OPEB, that those are two important stabilizers, that we wouldn't change course and suddenly say, no, let's go ahead and use it all to balance our budget. Like, that would be a complete redirection that I think would be in opposition to the recommendations of, or what the city and what CDE are frankly looking for.
Yeah, and I definitely wouldn't support that. So,
yeah.
Or maybe I guess I would wonder, could we, as a board, say in December that we're gonna commit the majority of it to rainy day and OPEB, and perhaps the staffing, if the 25 million in staffing makes sense, but not use it for the other uses, but to say, look, if we want to come back to this, we can. I mean, if it's in the rainy day reserve, I guess would be the more appropriate thing. Couldn't we then take it back out of the reserve if we wanted to? Do you see what I'm saying? Like if we put it in the rainy day reserve, we could then take it back out if we felt it was necessary in the spring even, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is where kind of the terminology of rainy day reserve versus our budget stabilization reserve, like I think maybe we'll need to talk to the controller's office also just about the mechanics of moving funds back and forth. Once it's in the rainy day reserve, we're definitely locking it away in the city's treasury more firmly, that the board needs to demonstrate that you need those funds in order to balance our budget. So in that way, I would encourage any component that's really intended to be flexible within the board's reserve. We've been calling it a budget stabilization reserve, but even that we could put forward a resolution that allows the board to, be more directive of when those funds can be unlocked.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I guess, so for me as one board member, my leaning right now would be to not use the funds for the budget balancing, but rather to use them for the rainy day reserve and OPEB and perhaps the staffing if that is negotiated and feels right. Because I think it just concerns me to sort of to use these one-time funds to deal with a structural deficit, because we're already doing that, right, with part of the 35 million, right, and that's also built in there. Isn't some of that one-time funding that we've built up over the past couple of years? So it just concerns me to use a lot of one-time funding to close our deficit for this coming year, I guess is my position on that.
Yes, that's correct. There are already one-time funds assumed within the balancing plan, so this would definitely increase that amount.
Thank you so much for your work on this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll chime in, Commissioner Bogus. So just wanted to go back. Megan, you asked a while ago about thoughts around the rainy day and bringing it to SFUSD. I am a big proponent of that. I think making sure that we have access, to those funds in case, like you said, we have a big dip and we need that access. And also, I also want to make sure that that's clear to the California Department of Education that those dollars set aside traditionally at the city is specifically for the district. So I would be a proponent of that and continuing those conversations with the controller's office and what that process looks like. Going back to the budget stabilization, I appreciate Commissioner Alexander and Bogus's comments around, does this, allocating the 25 million options B mean that we're still going to be absorbing those costs in year 3? I think one thing that I would, and I appreciate that fiscal tenure of the approach. One thing that I think I would want some more details around is then, how would that impact students and their, educational experience in the classroom specifically? Because that's one thing about year 3. Certainly the multi-year projections is still really key, that we would, there be still a bit of a cliff. Then I would want it to be clear for what that would mean potentially staffing wise, personnel wise as well. So that, again, for that transparency that we've been hearing from our community, how's this going to impact my child's school, or how's it going to impact the programs that my students, and we heard from some students just tonight, right, about what that would mean. So I just think I would want to be very clear about that as well, both for board members such as myself, but also for the public as we sprint to the final December 14th. And certainly I hear that, that doesn't behoove us from, bringing that back after January and hearing what our, what the state's plans are. So with that, I would also, coupled with that, would be supportive of then a separate budget stabilization reserve, as Megan, you have put forward, and then also just be very clear through a staff, a recommended resolution to staff around those clear criteria, because I just wouldn't want it to be, we just have to fill some financial gap because we had to. I think we have to be really clear that this has to have student impact and educational outcomes, because that's one thing right now that, as we come, as we're steering through the pandemic, we're steering through really staffing challenges and overall workforce, crisis, frankly. Like, how is it that we're gonna, continue to make that progress and support for our students and their educational outcomes? So I hope that it gives you a sense of kind of where I'm at. Megan, if you need clarity, I can be more.
Yeah, I mean,
Correct.
maybe just to restate a little bit what I've heard is, I think we're looking at actually 3 reserves. That we have our 2% required economic reserve, as it's required by the state. On top of that, we're socking away $40 million in a rainy day reserve. That would those funds would be more firmly locked. That the board would act in the event of an actual rainy day, much like the board would act to release the funds from the city's accounts. And then the final reserve is the budget stabilization, where we could dip into it in order to make sure that we're able to support those programs and supports that that are necessary to achieve the desired outcomes for our students. That's what I'm hearing, and maybe also pulling together a little bit. Is that consistent with your thinking, Commissioner Lam?
Yes, and I would actually thank you for reminding me, because between the rainy day reserve, set aside of the minimum for our reserves, it doesn't quite get us, it does not get, it's at 6%, I believe you said. I would want to increase that even closer to the 10%. So maybe we'll take in the middle. How can we increase it to 8%?
Commissioner Lam, I want to correct the record. My calculation, this is actually good news, but I apologize for misstating earlier. The 6% was tied to the 40 million. But if we're reducing our expenses and increasing our reserves, the combination of our existing economic uncertainty reserve and this 40 million is just over 9%. So we're actually quite close. So I apologize for misstating that earlier. Definitely want to correct the record that I would tie those to being closer to 9%.
Great, that's super helpful. So then we could even get to the 10% then with that third of the budget stabilization to get us to that 10%. So that's a preference that I have. I also just want to name how important the OPEB pre-funding is. And I would like to give that opportunity to, either you, Megan, or even to our, let's see, sorry.
Did we lose?
Commissioner, we appear to have lost our quorum, so we will need to wait and hope that Commissioner Lam can reconnect.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
So, I mean, it makes it simpler if it's just you, Commissioner, but.
That's right. I vote for everything. I'm glad that someone's paying attention to the fact that I would not have caught that, because Commissioner Bogus is here, but he's not technically a committee member. So.
I'm texting her right now.
And we're back.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi tapped out. So if we could also have Mr. Duchamp explain a bit about the OPEB, the importance and what he sees across the state as well, and really, as we embark on this to address our long-term liabilities, I'd like to get Elliot's perspective.
Thank you, Commissioner. Couple of comments, and I appreciate the opportunity. Now I just realized that the light in this room is kind of odd, so I'm sorry for the glare. The OPEB is a critical issue because that's an ongoing, growing issue that kind of like the reverse of a good stock. It's going to gain money, but that money is money you have to pay in future years. And with a growing increase in age, and I know you have actuarials in the district, that is not going to get better. And that's one of, I'm putting together recommendations for next week. And I think that's a critical issue to get a handle on that. And I just might say that even beyond the next 3 years, which is what the state is looking at, you don't want to be in a position at year 4 to say we have to get a loan. The other comment I want to make is that the biggest driver of your structural deficit is maintaining existing staff levels with declining enrollment. So where you need to make cuts in the budget are where your enrollment is declining. And that doesn't necessarily mean there's less service at a school site. I mean, if you have 400 students instead of 600 students, they really don't need the staff you had at 600 students. So I want to really clarify that when you're dealing, because I dealt with declining enrollment for 17 years, and it isn't fun, but you can project your staffing needs and oftentimes deal with it with things like attrition and other things. But that's the main thing. If I were sitting as a commissioner, I would be looking beyond the 3 years even in terms of where that enrollment's going, because that's a trend that's probably not going to reverse, so that you have a practice in place to deal with that enrollment decline and still provide the needed supports to schools. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's your driver. And the thing is, in some respects, if you have to reduce staff, even by attrition, which we're, no harm, no foul to the people who would be leaving, that's probably going to increase your OPEB obligation because you have more staff that are not working than are working. That proportion increases. So back to the initial question, OPEB is absolutely critical. And secondly, the main driver, if we were going to root causes, is going to be declining enrollment.
Thank you so much. So again, thank you. And panelists, please mute if you're not speaking, please. Thank you. So with that, affirming how important it is from my perspective of the pre-funding of OPEB, both in options B and C. So I think that's my current round of comments and questions, but I certainly welcome Commissioner Bogus.
Commissioner Alexander, did you have something first? I saw you.
Go ahead, you go first. That's good. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess my concern is that we aren't dealing with the structure of our school district enough within this balancing plan. It seems to get us to a safe place, but doesn't kind of change the dynamics of how we operate as a district. And I think the concern for me projecting forward to the budget is that we will be presenting that we have kind of a similar capacity than we kind of previously had, when there actually will be kind of a larger feel in the reduction of services because of kind of the cuts that are expected. And I guess how do we balance that? How do we kind of have how are we having conversations with folks about that? Because I feel like it has been expressed to me on the board as far as like how critical our budget situation is and how we have to shrink the size of our district and reduce staffing and increase class sizes. And I don't feel like maybe that we're saying that enough. And I guess just to say, like, do we feel like this plan essentially shores us up in the long term for where we need to be? Or is this essentially kind of our first step of kind of getting aligned, and that in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to actually have to come back and look at doing some major restructuring or reorganizing of our institution?
Thank you, Commissioner. I think I'm going to pick a hybrid of the options that you just laid out, that we're not by any means done. And we're also not going to have the luxury of waiting a couple or a few years to come back. I think that this does get us in a safe place for now. And really between now and budget development for fiscal year 23-24, we're going to need to continue the work. And I think part of what I hope I brought to the table of trying to engage my colleagues and the board and the public around zero-based budgeting is not that we're doing a perfect round of zero-based budgeting, it's just getting our minds around what is core and essential to our districts and what are the things we do because they're priorities and what are enhancements. And I think we've done a pretty good job given the conditions that we've been in the pandemic and just all of the different exercises that staff has had to go through, to keep moving on and making sure that our students are being supported through all of this, to come up with an initial balancing plan. But I think we're also learning. It's a first attempt at really shoring things up. But we also know that we have declining enrollment. I'm going to go ahead and touch on the third rail that nobody wants to talk about, is that we also have a lot more school sites than many other districts, and therefore the administrative burden of carrying those school sites is very high for our district. I also think that we need to get a better handle on what are our functions as a district versus a county office. And these are all things that are ongoing bodies of work. And I wouldn't dare say that we can solve all of them in 1 year. I know between Anne-Marie Myung and I, we're certainly trying, but this is about as far as we're gonna get at this point in time. So I would say we've done just to recap, we've done a really good job, but I think that there are bodies of work that need to continue to help ride us along so that when we get into budget development next year and we continue to see that deficit on the horizon, by then we'll have done more work to evaluate how to address these structural issues, particularly around enrollment and how we want to provide services to our students.
No, I appreciate that clarity. And I think the one more thing I think for me just to bring up, and then I'll let Commissioner Alexander continue, is I think I worry about our ability to perform like the required tasks with the projected cuts that we currently have in the budget. I mean, and just to lift it up, I think like hearing people's concern around the central office spending and kind of like the desire to reduce funding from there, it makes me wonder how we'll operate as a district with reduced staffing there because we're so dependent on them to support school sites. And so for me, I feel like the part of the conversation about what does it look like for us to adapt and to be responsive after these cuts still needs to happen. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to kind of have a more full conversation in the spring about it. Because for me, it's like we can say that we'll make these cuts on paper, but for the people who have to actually do it, their workload isn't being reduced. And I think we need to figure out how we're addressing that so that we really can see enrollment grow. I do actually feel like our enrollment is going to increase and that we have kind of the power to pull people back into our district just because I feel like our city is also in a place where it wants to grow too. So I'll pause there and make way for others.
Thank you. Commissioner Alexander?
Thank you. Yeah, I had a bunch of thoughts. I think I respectfully disagree with Commissioner Bogus about enrollment. I don't know. Maybe it'll grow. I think. Well, I was going to say I think I hope that's true, but my concern is that it seems like it's a statewide and even a national trend, and so I don't know if we can buck that trend. I mean, we are bucking it a little bit. Our enrollment has actually declined less than the statewide average, which is good, but it's not. I don't know that we're going to see increases. And I think Mr. Duchamp's point that really the root cause of the deficit is that we have enrollment that doesn't sustain our staff. So the enrollment has fallen slightly and revenue hasn't increased. And so now we have too many staff. And it's very clear that we're going to have to make staff reductions and they're going to be significant staff reductions. And so I think there's a piece that's a little bit missing from some of this conversation, which is where we make those staff reductions. And I think, I think folks may know that Commissioner Sanchez and I are working on an alternative proposal that, because we've done a lot of analysis. The two of us actually have been in this district for 25 plus years as teachers and then principals. And we've actually seen how our budget has shifted over the years. We were talking today about how back in the 90s, a principal reported to an assistant superintendent who reported directly to the superintendent. So there was 2 layers above a principal. Now we have principal, director, assistant superintendent, deputy superintendent, superintendent. And I think that just sort of illustrates what's happened over the past 20 years, not through any bad intentions, but I think bureaucracies have a habit of growing. We looked at some data from 2009-10. Back in 2009-10, we had 2 deputy superintendents, we had 3 chiefs, and we had 24 executive directors and directors. So that was 10 years ago. Now we have 3 deputy superintendents, 12 chiefs, and 76 executive directors and directors. So these are all folks that are making between $130,000 and $250,000 a year in salary alone, not to mention benefits. When we compare to comparable districts, we had some conversation about Long Beach, but actually when you look at any large district in California, we spend a lot more on administration, we spend more on indirect services, and we spend less on direct classroom instruction and other school-based services like social workers and folks that are actually at the school serving kids. And so I think we're going to have to make these cuts. They're going to be hard cuts. There's going to be reductions in service. But I think the question that faces the board is what's the fiscally responsible way to make those cuts? So Commissioner Sanchez and I are going to say more about that next week's committee of the whole and formally kind of introduce that proposal. But I'm a big proponent. All that being said, I'm a big proponent of making the cuts. Like I really think we need to do it, and not that I'm excited about it, but that's what I was saying earlier. Is I just don't think we can kid ourselves into thinking we can't have this conversation. I think that's going to be a hard conversation, and we can have a really good debate over where do we make those cuts, right? But I think we have to make them because we just don't have the enrollment to sustain the staffing that we have as a district. And so that I just wanted to say that kind of given the previous line of conversation. But the question I had really was around OPEB, and again, Chief Wallace, if this is not the right forum or if we want to do this as a follow-up, I just would love to get more detail on that, especially with our declining staff and some of the questions I had asked earlier just around how do we calculate the demand. I really think we should make that investment. And I would argue if we don't put it in OPEB, like if the OPEB investment is smaller, then we should increase the rainy day investment, right? So I want to be clear on that. But I would just love to get some documentation on that of like, how do we calculate that 60 million number based on the need, so we could share that with the public at some point.
Sure. Just for a little bit of context about how I got the numbers, I did work with our actuary who prepares a report that's required by CDE. The actuarial report that we use maps out some of the details around the number of currently retired employees and certificated, classified, and other types of positions, and looks at the current number of those retirees and then extrapolates out on the current number of employees at our district and looking into the future, anticipating how many retirees we'll have over time. And so working with our actuary, I was able to create a model that then allows me to develop different scenarios to estimate what our liability will be based upon different levels of investment. And what we found was that 50 million is the sweet spot, 50 million plus $10 million committed to pre-funding on an ongoing basis. And so 60 million is really 50 million in the first year and 10 million in the second, so as not to mess up our deficit outlook in that second year. And so it was working with our actuary, having him review the model and validate it so that we would have a tool to help us have a working way of testing out the value of our different levels of investment. And I will say it's very complicated. I learned a lot working with our actuary. So I'd be happy to, find a forum to present that information, maybe even bring our actuary in, because my understanding of it is still fairly rudimentary compared to his understanding. So, but at least now you have a foundation that the number was not given to me. I do have a very good understanding of the calculations, and these numbers were reviewed and validated by our actuary.
Yeah, no, I assumed that, and it makes perfect sense. And I guess I would I think that a forum like that would be great, just because I've been getting questions about it, which I am much farther away from you and being able to answer. So I guess I wanted to be able to sort of just make that data available, like how do we come to that number? So yeah, if we could figure that out, either in a written document or in a forum, I think would be fantastic. Thank you.
I'm going to wrap up our discussion for tonight. I hope staff feels that this has been productive, useful as far as guiding us to getting us to the balancing plan of December 14th. And we have our big December 7th. And I look forward to learning in detail about Commissioner Alexander and Sanchez's proposal. I've been asked about it. I don't have all the details to it because then it'd be violating Brown Act. So, and staying true to that. One thing I did want to ask, a request for Mr. Duchamp. I know that you had mentioned that you're going to have some recommendations for next Tuesday and talking about the overall, as you and your team have now dove in for probably 6 weeks now, maybe at most. But would really like to hear from you on Tuesday around, what has been the impact or effect of, like you said, the declining of enrollment and then the staffing ratios and what you see is really before us as a district to not only the decisions, but really that longer term beyond that 3 to 5 year. Because Commissioner Bogus, as much as I want to be optimistic, I would think that I would like to plan for that the enrollment will continue to what we've seen. And it's not just COVID, it was actually declining now, right? We're in our 5th year of decline. And certainly we shall put together some plans around, how do we think about increasing that enrollment? What does our 0 through 5, or especially our children of ages 3 to 5 and with transitional kindergarten look like? But to me, that's a longer term planning. So, Mr. Duchamp, if I could request that next week, if that is going to be part of your presentation or recommendation around declining enrollment, the size of our district, and, in operations, frankly, overall.
Yeah, and I'll give you a little movie trailer here that I think a lot of it is going to have to do with the couple things you just said, Commissioner Lamb, and that's that irrespective of whether enrollment grows or declines, what the district needs is processes in place to be facile about that and to adapt to it a little bit more readily than at least what I've observed. So that's going to be part of it, to put in place operations that work and can allow you to adapt to coming years. And I've heard a lot of that conversation, and I think that's really good. I think also to look at, and I applaud that there's going to be other options put on the table. I don't think anybody's going to know till you get till January and you have your early enrollment projections and your allocation projections for schools, how to deal with both the district office support and the school site support. And I think the process, I know there's a lot of angst and a lot of pain, but we don't know yet till we get those numbers what it's really going to look like. And you do have a significant amount of attrition, as does every single district in the state with employees. So it may be more a matter of not filling positions. And I don't want to make any promises. Some people may be riffed. So, okay, that's the trailer, the good and the bad.
Thank you. Commissioner Bogus, maybe after your comment or question, we'll wrap up for this evening.
Thank you. Yeah, just one last question. In regard to the sample kind of proposed school site budgets, I'm curious as to what kind of advisement and kind of support sites would have in making difficult budget decisions. So like looking at the site that had to get rid of the literacy coach, like would we be advising a site not to do that if they are having issues around literacy with, you know, focal populations like Black students or other students, or would it be solely kind of left to the discretion of the site and the school site council process? And just kind of, I guess, how do we handle those types of things?
So I'm really not not meaning for this to be a debate with Commissioner Alexander, but they would actually be, those are the kinds of discussions that they would have with their directors and their assistant soups. And that's where that support would come from. I mean, we give some guidance, but the real heart of those conversations around what the school looks like, they talk to their staff, they talk to their team, but then the support really comes from the directors and assistant soups.
Okay, and so that's this kind of the decision-making process internally, and then ultimately you would present kind of a budget for the school sites to us kind of based on all that information that's kind of reflective of that. But ultimately the decision is at the site through multiple layers of like chain of command and communication.
Correct, exactly.
Okay, that's my last question. Thank you so much for that clarity.
So at this time, I know that, out of this tonight's meeting, we wanted to give the budget team some clear direction from this committee to scaffold and as we get ready for Tuesday night's community as a whole, as far as specifically to the Prop G scenarios of funds, because that will play into an important part of the balancing plan, the overall balancing plan. From our discussions tonight, I heard that there was between Commissioner Bogus and Alexander option D, or really doing the supporting the pre-funding of OPEB, the rainy day fund, as well as a potential of that third, ensuring that third reserve, the budget stabilization reserve. I expressed my support for option B. As well, I would certainly be supportive of D, but I think B also gives us a bit of an on-ramp for us to understand what, how those reductions at school sites will look like. What will that mean for student learning experiences? So I just wanted to reiterate some summary that I heard. Mr. Alexander.
Sorry, just to clarify that. So I was actually not supporting any of the options. I was almost suggesting an option E, which would be, well, close to option D, but spending less on, I would say if the staffing piece, the 25 million for staffing, it makes sense with labor partners, then perhaps that, but then adding to the rainy day reserve. So putting 60 million in OPEB and more in the rainy day reserve, which was something that wasn't really on there. So I wonder if that might be able to be added, something along those lines.
Megan, does that give you some direction there? Or were you hoping for a consensus recommendation from this committee? I don't know if we'll get there tonight, but.
It's really helpful just to hear these ideas. And I guess my general sense is we're headed in the right direction of having rainy day and reserve and OPEB. And so then it's a matter of, I think, how that final piece of funds, the 35 million, is distributed, either as a stable budget or staffing stabilization or redistributed to those other areas. So maybe with that input, I guess what I would recommend is that's helpful to hear tonight, and we'll come back with some additional thinking next week on Tuesday, and we'll also be trying to walk the halls a bit more with commissioners, and we do want to put forward, the balancing plan that's closest to being ready for consensus on the 14th. So it's really that final piece that is the part that's up in the air. Any element of that that's identified for a stabilization component, that's the risk. If we put forward a plan on the 14th that includes 25 million, I think then we would need to be clear if the board had different direction, that it's clear how those funds would be used. So anyway, we just got to think about how we can be flexible and adapt in these final steps for approval. But I think this is a really helpful start.
Commissioner Alexander, if you'd be willing to take a friendly, friendly amendment, and not official amendment, but you had mentioned rainy day. I think for me, it's really to make sure that rainy day is still classified as rainy day, which has, I think, a separate type of classification. Let's say a reserve for.
Sorry, I meant more along the line. Sorry, I didn't express myself. What you're saying is what I meant to say. Okay. I think Chief Wallace got it.
Okay.
And again, I wasn't trying to make a specific proposal. I was just saying in general that was where I was leaning. So thank you.
And I see a nod from Commissioner Bogus. So hopefully, Megan, this gives you and the team some clear direction as we head into for the sprint to next Tuesday. So
yes,
I just want to thank you all to the budget team again, the tremendous work that you all are putting in day out. And I just wanted to express my deep appreciation for the work. Also to Mr. Duchamp, thank you so much to you and your team for really steering and guiding and being a true partner. I can't just express just that expertise and how I can, has really been shared with this board. And I hope you, and you've said it before, but really the seriousness that this board is really taking and ensuring that our district, our beloved district with our students is going to be fiscally solvent and healthy. So thank you all so much and have a great evening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.